In the wake of natural disasters and long-standing coastal challenges, Japan dumped 1 billion tons of concrete into the ocean, sparking an uproar among scientists, locals, and the international community.
This is the wall that saved Fudai, a village which stands intact on Japan's devastated northeast coast.
As dramatic as it sounds, this large-scale venture was part of Japan's strategy to protect its coasts from harsh storms, powerful tsunamis, and rising sea levels.
When the tsunami hit, the water came over and crashed down and broke these concrete blocks. It then ran 300 meters up here.
From the beginning, critics feared the worst: decimation of marine habitats, collapse of fisheries, and further erosion of public trust in government-led interventions. Yet what happened years later was unexpected. Instead of unfolding precisely as skeptics predicted, the massive deposits of concrete revealed outcomes no one saw coming. Backdrop and motivations. Japan's coastline, a sprawling geographic tapestry of cliffs, sandy beaches, and key fishing zones, has long been altered by human-made structures. From the post-war economic boom through to the late 20th century, coastal engineering saw an unprecedented rise. Seawalls, breakwaters, and tetrapods became iconic symbols of modernization, intended to protect cities and farmlands from relentless waves. By some estimates, more than half of Japan's 35,000 kilometers of shoreline had been armored in concrete by the early 2000s. Despite already having formidable coastal defenses, the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami proved these measures insufficient. Towering walls of seawater easily overran existing barriers, devastating entire communities and causing tragic loss of life. The heartbreak and destruction rattled the country. Local governments, recognizing the catastrophic shortfall of the existing structures, sought ways to bolster defenses. In many regions, proposals to build taller and longer seawalls gained traction. Public sentiment was torn. Some saw these reinforced concrete structures as a life-saving necessity. Others questioned whether repeating the same failed approach on a more massive scale could truly shield communities from the next mega disaster. Meanwhile, environmental considerations weighed heavily. Japan's coastline is an economic lifeline for fisheries, tourism, and local cultural practices. The earlier attempts at hard engineering had already transformed sandy beaches into concrete embankments, disrupting fish nurseries and the natural flow of sediment. Many communities feared that further massive projects could rob them of the last vestiges of their connection to the sea. However, local governments faced an impossible dilemma. In the face of increasingly frequent storms and a warming climate driving sea level rise, a protective barrier seemed the only viable way to reduce risk. This was not just about tsunami fortifications. There were also developments around Fukushima, including the complicated matter of contaminated wastewater from the Daiichi nuclear power plant. Parallel discussions about nuclear safety and disposing of vast quantities of water overshadowed, or sometimes intersected with, the broader conversation about dumping or placing 1 billion tons of concrete around coastal areas. In short, Japan's motivations for amping up concrete usage in the ocean were not purely an engineering obsession. They were rooted in a confluence of survival needs, political mandates, and social anxieties that peaked in the post-2011 era. From the vantage point of local and national policymakers, massive infrastructural fortifications seemed an obvious, if brutal, solution. At the same time, early critics pointed out that focusing solely on gray solutions bypassed decades of research suggesting green or mixed strategies. Environmental groups reminded decision-makers that sand dunes, wetlands, and even newly emerging reef-building projects could all lessen wave energy while preserving natural habitats. Nevertheless, the wheels were set in motion. Plans evolved on local and national levels, funneling billions of yen into large-scale seafront reinforcements. The stage was set for an enormous operation, one that would alter the coastline, and, as many feared, the delicate balance of marine life. Years later, people would recall this phase as the moment Japan dumped an unprecedented 1 billion tons of concrete into the ocean, with all the dramatic repercussions that followed. Early forecasts and expectations. Before the first truckloads of concrete even arrived at Japan's coastal zones, government agencies and engineering experts made a range of forecasts about the likely outcomes. Many of these assessments were published in policy papers, engineering proposals, and environmental impact statements. Government officials argued that towering seawalls could absorb or blunt the energy of surging waves, thereby buying local communities precious minutes to evacuate in case of future tsunamis. Some simulations showed that a combination of upgraded walls and quick alert systems would dramatically lower casualty rates compared to 2011. Proponents of these robust structures pointed to the reassurance of physical barriers, visible and solid, that would offer a protective bulwark along vulnerable coastlines. Local authorities in regions like Fukushima, Miyagi, and Iwate suggested that such barriers extending many meters above sea level would usher in a new era of safety. Backers of the plan touted advanced concrete designs. Some versions included specialized ridges to break wave force, drainage channels to minimize overflow, and even floodgates that could open and close automatically in emergencies. Some in the fishing industry, especially those who had felt betrayed by earlier protective measures that failed in 2011, pinned cautious optimism on these improved walls.
After the construction of the seawall was confirmed, I was able to get permission to rebuild my bed and breakfast. It's thanks to the wall that I could rebuild, and now I have a job.
Hoping they would rebuild consumer confidence in local seafood, overshadowing the region's post-disaster reputation. Meanwhile, construction giants in Japan welcomed the upcoming projects, seeing them as a financial boon. A major surge in infrastructure spending promised to kickstart local economies, offering jobs and corporate contracts. But beneath the celebratory announcements and economic forecasts, a growing chorus of concern was building momentum, challenging the narrative of progress at any cost. From the outset, ecological researchers, marine biologists, and environmental NGOs expressed deep misgivings. On the scientific front, the consensus was that large swaths of continuous concrete would disrupt natural sand movement and degrade ecosystems that supported fish, crustaceans, and seabirds. Critics pointed out that coastlines are dynamic systems, shifting, eroding, and depositing sand in response to tides and storms. Encasing them in concrete essentially locks them in place, transforming living shores into inert edges. Organizations also worried that a false sense of security might lead communities to relax other disaster readiness measures, like evacuation drills and improved building standards inland. The build higher walls approach might become a barrier, literally and figuratively, to exploring holistic solutions, such as restoring natural buffers or relocating communities to higher ground. Opinions varied among residents in tsunami-affected areas. Some welcomed the plan, desperate for any sense of relief from the nightmares of the previous disaster. Others, especially younger generations, worried that these gray fortresses would sever them from the ocean, a cultural and emotional lifeblood in many fishing villages. Over time, that could discourage tourism, hamper recreation, and ironically, weaken local communities' financial resilience. Ultimately, early forecasts painted a contradictory picture: bright optimism versus deep worry. Most parties recognized that erecting miles of concrete barriers was no small undertaking, but few could anticipate the exact shape of future events. Little did they know that years later, something unexpected would happen, throwing both doomsday fears and overly rosy predictions into question. Japan dumps 1 billion tons of concrete into the ocean, the start. When the first headlines began to echo the sentiment that Japan dumped 1 billion tons of concrete into the ocean, they were usually describing the massive multi-phase construction of coastal fortifications. Bulldozers, cargo ships, and heavy machinery mobilized in some of the hardest-hit areas, particularly along the northeastern shorelines. The scope was enormous, with newly planned seawall structures soaring up to 10 or even 15 meters above sea level in certain segments, their foundations plunging deep below the seafloor for stability. Construction trucks carried concrete mix round the clock to staging areas, while locals sometimes woke at dawn to the roar of heavy equipment, glimpsing towering rebar skeletons soon to be filled with thick slabs. Beyond erecting continuous walls, Japanese engineers experimented with placing huge concrete blocks offshore to blunt wave force. Some initiatives called them breakwaters, others artificial reefs. The idea was to scatter these massive blocks in strategic patterns to reduce wave energy before it hit the main seawall.
We can reduce tsunami overflow and we can get some time.
Yet despite this nuance, the general public and media took one look at these piles of concrete and saw them as an extension of the same approach, large-scale dumping into the ocean. Still, Japanese authorities believed that this was their only alternative at the time. Coordinating these colossal efforts demanded not just local, but also national planning. Highways were rerouted or expanded to facilitate shipping of materials, and temporary ports popped up to handle barge traffic delivering ready-made concrete segments. The cost ballooned, supported by a post-disaster recovery budget that funneled trillions of yen into reconstruction projects. On the ground, public reactions were mixed. Many residents felt ambivalent, finding comfort in the prospect of robust defense against future tsunamis while simultaneously troubled by the sheer visual and environmental scale of these projects. Environmental activists staged protests, urging officials to consider whether the short-term protective gain was overshadowed by irreversible harm to marine ecosystems. Meanwhile, the fishing community remained divided, with some fishers noting that their prime spawning grounds might be choked by sediment stirred up during the large construction phases, while others looked for silver linings, hoping for new fish habitats around the artificial reefs, an outcome that sometimes occurs when fish adapt to sheltered man-made structures. By the end of this initial dumping stage, large swaths of coastline had lost their natural look. Vast gray silhouettes replaced sandy coves. Whether or not these barriers would truly deliver on the promise of improved safety remained to be tested. At this point, though, all eyes turned to the environment. Would marine life be wiped out, or could it adapt and thrive? The immediate outcomes were far from conclusive, leaving a vast unknown hanging in the sea air. Global echoes and regional politics. The ripple effects of Japan's dumping of 1 billion tons of concrete into the ocean spread well beyond its own shores. Neighbors like South Korea, China, and Pacific Island nations watched these developments with a mix of apprehension and curiosity. Many of these countries had pre-existing tensions or ongoing concerns about marine pollution, nuclear wastewater releases, and cross-border fish stock management. In international and regional gatherings, Japan's robust coastal construction faced intense scrutiny, with representatives from smaller island nations already alarmed by rising sea levels and ocean acidification, questioning whether Japan's actions could set a precedent for other nations to adopt similarly large-scale dumping methods. NGOs throughout Asia and the Pacific banded together, sharing research on potential negative impacts, warning that once a country of Japan's economic clout normalized the mass introduction of concrete structures, others might follow suit under the banner of climate resilience, potentially leading to widespread ecological damage in fragile marine environments. The controversy extended into trade relations, as some worried about the effect on Japanese seafood exports. In the early years following the 2011 nuclear disaster, the fishing industries of Fukushima and neighboring prefectures had already suffered public distrust. Now, with massive construction projects rumored to harm biodiversity, there was a real possibility that foreign markets might shy away from Japanese fish products, fearing contamination or ecosystem imbalances. While some pointed out that the artificially reinforced coastline might have unforeseen benefits, such as new artificial reefs for certain species potentially boosting fish populations, this speculation was mostly overshadowed by suspicion. Nations in the region demanded more robust data to gauge any cross-border environmental consequences, noting that ocean currents do not respect political boundaries, and any large-scale changes in marine ecosystems could affect migratory species that swim beyond Japanese territory. Though the engineering logic behind each approach varied, the international sentiment was that Japan should be more transparent, bring in more scientific oversight, and cooperate with its neighbors who also depend on the Pacific's health. Calls grew louder for third-party reviews of Japan's environmental impact data on both concrete-based coastal reinforcements and nuclear wastewater discharges. Marine biologists from countries as far away as Australia and the United States offered to collaborate on long-term impact studies. While certain Japanese universities welcomed the idea, bureaucratic barriers sometimes slowed progress. By mid-decade, it was clear that Japan's high-stakes efforts had become an international flashpoint. Some nations empathized with the desire for robust tsunami defenses and recognized the scale of Japan's predicament, but worry persisted. Meanwhile, local communities in Japan were bracing for the unknown ecological ramifications. What happened years later would soon reveal itself, and for some observers, it was unexpected in ways that even the experts did not fully predict. The turning point: what happened years later. It began with anecdotal sightings. Fishermen operating near newly installed breakwaters started reporting unusual catches. Species of shellfish and fish that were seldom found in those waters began appearing in nets. Local divers, curious about the dramatic coastline changes, discovered surprising pockets of marine growth, clinging to concrete surfaces. News trickled out in small publications and local media, describing how certain algae, seaweeds, and barnacles had colonized these submerged structures. Within a few years, some breakwaters developed a layer of encrusting organisms: sponges, sea anemones, or even small corals in warmer areas. This was not universal, but it did happen in specific zones with favorable water temperature and current flows. Marine ecologists who visited these sites documented early successional communities, basically the pioneers of an evolving reef ecosystem. While the majority of the coastline remained stark and uninviting for some species, pockets of vibrant marine life were blossoming. Local fishers in certain districts found that near the concrete wave breakers, certain fish populations stabilized or even increased. A few reported better catches of octopus, cuttlefish, or certain reef fish that found refuge on the ridge surfaces. Conversely, some fishermen lamented that in other areas the environment never recovered. They complained that the ocean floor had been smothered, removing the foundation for shellfish or the seaweed forests essential for abalone. So it was hardly a uniform success story. The unexpected phenomenon was more about certain bright spots in an otherwise grim forecast. Curiously, tourism saw an uptick in a few towns that marketed their new coastlines as something futuristic. While critics scoffed at the idea of traveling to see giant concrete structures, adventurous travelers came for scenic novelty, especially if any local diving experiences showcased the emergent marine growth. Urban youth groups even organized graffiti reefs, sanctioned art projects on the portion of the concrete structure above water, combining environmental activism with street art flair. Meanwhile, the overshadowing dread that had engulfed many communities in the immediate years after 2011 began, in some locations, to lift. The towering walls, while they might still feel oppressive, offered local inhabitants a measure of psychological security. They could not forget the heartbreak of the tsunami, but they rested easier knowing something massive stood between them and the sea's fury. And ironically, the developing marine life behind or around these structures reminded them that nature endures. Newspaper editorials that once described the billion tons of concrete purely in ominous terms began to include stories of these modest ecological recoveries. Scientists were quick to emphasize that these were partial glimpses, and that we must not interpret the presence of barnacles and fish as proof that large-scale concrete dumping was wholly beneficial. Nonetheless, the narrative complexity increased. In some corners, the ocean was unexpectedly regenerating a measure of life along the concrete surfaces. And that was unexpected by many who predicted a near-complete marine desert. This shift in public perception did not erase legitimate concerns about ecological harm, nor did it fully justify the massive construction. Yet it illuminated a surprising adaptability in certain marine species. That nuance, the mixture of ecological damage and unexpected resilience, would define the next phase of debate in coastal communities. Parallels with Fukushima wastewater controversy. While the massive concrete deployments garnered their own controversies, the separate, and sometimes conflated, issue of Japan's plan to release Fukushima's treated nuclear wastewater into the Pacific commanded parallel headlines. Since both issues revolve around the ocean and potential harm, many communities lump them together under one uneasy umbrella. Japan is dumping harmful materials into our shared seas. In areas hardest hit by the Fukushima disaster, trust in official pronouncements was precariously low. The decision-making behind huge concrete dumps seemed to echo the same top-down style that residents saw in nuclear waste discussions. When the central government insisted the water release was safe, skepticism rose because they recalled unfulfilled promises around coastal management. Fishermen already traumatized by the nuclear accident dreaded further brand damage to their catch. Even if the water release was scientifically safe, the mere perception of risk, combined with the specter of possible contamination from large-scale coastal building, compounded fears. Both the billion tons of concrete into the ocean narrative and the nuclear wastewater plan triggered demands for international monitoring. The Pacific Islands Forum, coastal nations, and international marine laboratories expressed concern. No one wants radioactive byproducts or large swaths of dead ocean on their doorstep. While concrete dumping represented a primarily physical disruption, altering ocean floors, wave dynamics, and coastal habitats, the radioactive water release raised chemical and radiological concerns involving isotopes, potential bioaccumulation in marine species, and fears of transboundary pollution. Despite these differences, the public lumped them under a single anxiety. The ocean is being used as a dumping ground, with uncertain consequences. The outcry heightened calls for truly independent reviews of both processes. Some scientists noted that if Japan was willing to erect expensive walls to guard communities, it should also be willing to store or treat wastewater more carefully, rather than discharging it. The rationale? If cost and speed justified the dumping of nuclear wastewater, perhaps the same rationale fueled reliance on giant concrete installations, overshadowing more nuanced solutions. In the end, discussion around the nuclear wastewater ironically served to open channels of dialogue about ocean stewardship. Joint committees formed, bridging topics like safe fish consumption, stable marine ecosystems, and disaster resilience. Though these committees could not reverse the large-scale approach already taken, they did place more emphasis on comprehensive environmental monitoring. Third-party labs began measuring radioactive isotopes in local waters, while marine biologists monitored species around the new concrete barriers. Over time, this synergy of oversight might prove beneficial, giving a broader understanding of how multiple stressors, both physical and chemical, impact Japan's coastal zones. And so, while the controversies were separate, they converged in the public consciousness to paint a big question mark. How can Japan ensure ensure that its quest for security and post-disaster recovery does not create a legacy of harm for the marine environment shared by all. Eco-innovations and marine restoration attempts. In the aftermath of these major interventions, a new wave of eco-innovation began gaining traction among universities, NGOs, and forward-thinking local governments. Acknowledging that Japan dumping 1 billion tons of concrete into the ocean might have severe side effects, various groups asked, can we at least modify or augment these structures to make them more nature-friendly? Borrowing from successes in other parts of the world, several pilot projects in Japan started retrofitting sections of existing concrete blocks with textured surfaces, cavities, or embedded panels to encourage aquatic life. This approach, dubbed living seawalls, introduced surfaces that replicate the crags and crevices of natural reefs. Early field tests indicated promising results, with barnacles, algae, and small fish colonizing these areas faster than plain concrete blocks. Additionally, some local governments allowed limited seaweed cultivation on or near breakwaters, hoping to create a protective habitat for juvenile fish while also generating a small economic return. Over time, these pockets could evolve into artificial reefs with a semblance of natural ecosystem complexity. Beyond the immediate marine realm, some researchers explored ways to reduce or offset the carbon footprint of future coastal fortifications. Concrete's production process typically involves significant CO2 emissions, but new, low-carbon or carbon-sequestering concrete can trap more CO2 in their curing phase. Although still nascent, pilot studies showed potential for drastically cutting the net emissions from large construction projects. Then, a controversial idea emerged. If treated radioactive water from Fukushima were fully purified and properly contained, might it be blended into concrete structures that remain on land, far from sensitive marine environments? The logic was that tritium, one of the primary radioactive isotopes, emits low-energy beta particles that cannot penetrate thick concrete. This approach, while technically complex, could minimize ocean discharges. However, regulatory hurdles, public fear, and cost concerns left the concept in limbo. Even so, it illustrated a growing appetite for creative, science-based approaches that avoid direct ocean dumping. None of these eco-innovations offered a simple fix. They required careful tailoring to local ecosystems, ongoing monitoring, and buy-in from local industries. Yet they signaled a cultural shift, a willingness to treat the ocean not just as a barrier to hold back, but as a partner to work alongside. While these more sustainable methods may never fully reverse the initial impact of massive concrete expansions, they represent a learning curve for a nation grappling with natural disasters and environmental responsibilities. Would a lighter touch have yielded better outcomes? And can we find safer, greener ways to coexist with nature's power? Share your thoughts below. Subscribe for more deep dives into complex global stories. And see you in the next one.